Representation, form, and content. In this lecture we're going to be looking at some of the key terms used in art to discuss art, starting with the whole notion of representation. There are three basic types of representation, the first of which is called representational art. Representational art refers to art that represents things in the world. So it takes things in the world and it shows them to us again visually. This is one example where we see a feather, glasses, some notebooks, pieces of paper pinned to a wall. This type of representation is one extreme. So in the whole range of how to represent images in the world, at one end, one part of the axis, you would have something that's very, very photographic, designed to literally trick the eye. And this type of representation is actually called trompe-l'oeil, which is the French for fool the eye. Statues such as Michelangelo's David would be called representational because they represent the idea of a human figure, in this case the biblical hero of David. Paintings with anything in it that's recognizable in the world, such as Michelangelo's wall in this back wall, the Sistine Chapel, called The Last Judgment, is also representational. So representational is pretty straightforward. It's the kind of art most people are very, very familiar with. Another type of representational art is art that's abstracted, work that depicts natural objects in simplified, distorted, or exaggerated ways. And this is a term you have to be careful with. Often the word abstract art means something else, and I'll come to that in a minute. But technically the word abstract means that you're taking something representational and you're reducing it, you're simplifying it, or you're exaggerating it, or you're distorting it, but the fact is you still recognize it as something else in the world that the painting is referring to. For example, here's a painting by Picasso. Picasso was famous for his distortions and the way he manipulated and changed up the visual language of Western art. But even though this woman has a rather strange looking face and body, we still recognize a woman sitting in a chair wearing a hat. So in this case, it's still a form of representational art. And the word abstract is used incorrectly in the art world. Abstract is often used to refer to works that don't refer to objects in the world. Paintings that might have, for example, a blue square in them, which is just a blue square. We call that abstract art in the art world, and that's technically the wrong use of the word abstract. Abstract art is always representational. Picasso was very strong about saying his work is never abstract in the artistic sense. It's abstract in the real definition of the term. It's always got something in it. This also is an abstracted image. You can see a kind of demon, and you can see a human at the bottom, and lots of traditional indigenous cultures who have patterns and designs that to us just look like shapes, to them often refer to creatures or personages, people in their mythology or their history or their storytelling. Something like this, a manga image, is also representational. It represents a person. But if somebody walked into a room looking like this, really looking like this, we'd probably all have a heart attack and die. It's not a real person, but it's still a person. It's just been exaggerated, distorted, simplified, etc. And an extreme form of abstraction would be something like this. Again, people don't look like this, but we understand it as a man and a woman walking. And then the third kind of art, which I've already referred to, is technically called non-representational art, also known as non-objective or non-figurative. And it's visual art that has no specific reference to anything in the world. So for example, this painting by Mark Rothko. These are just three rectangular shapes. Two are red, one is kind of a warm, pale, brownish white. And they're not really anything in terms of signifying something. Now they could, to you, mean they could be three doors, it could be three windows, it could be an aerial view of three buses. You could probably make up in your imagination anything you want for it to represent. But the painting by itself doesn't necessarily say that. It's to be like the abstracted image we saw of the two people crossing the road in the road sign. You can't really interpret that many other ways than what it is. You can't say it's two fish flying a kite or whatever. You can't make it up. But with non-representational art, you can imagine it might be something, but the art itself is not necessarily that. And so we refer to that as non-representational. Here's another one, 3 white panels, painted by the American painter Robert Rauschenberg in 1951. You're probably wondering, regardless of the terminology, why this is included in the history of art, why this is a famous painting, and I'm not going to tell you right now. I'm going to leave that alone till we get to the 20th century. But here again we have another example of art that does not refer to or reference anything, any object, any event in the physical world that we know. Sculpture by Andy Goldsworthy. Here he's making sculpture out of natural objects, in this case leaves in rivers and water basins, and he's just arranged them and made a circle. And that's all it is. And we refer to this again as non-representational art. Again, you might think of it as an eye, as a sun, you can come up with anything, but essentially it is just a geometric shape. And so it's this kind of art which is often referred to as abstract, which I said was obviously incorrect. Sometimes, however, it's difficult to tell. Art doesn't always fall easily into one category or another. So for many people, the Japanese flag might just be a red circle. No reference to anything. But to people living in Japan who know a little bit about the Japanese flag, it references and represents the sun. So sometimes the boundary between is it non-representational or is it totally abstracted is a very fuzzy boundary. Many times the artist will recognize it as being something, but a viewer who doesn't have that background or that context won't necessarily see it that way. And so for them it might be non-representational. These are 3 terms that come up a lot in the history of art and 3 terms you need to try to understand. So this slide is actually a mistake. I'm sorry. It should say representational art, not non-representational. So even I'm getting confused here. So the slide's wrong. It should say representational art, and you can see that representational art has 2 extremes. At one end we have highly realistic works of art, such as trompe-l'oeil style. At the other end we have increasingly more abstracted types of art where we get more and more simple, in which case, for example, a stick figure would represent probably an extreme form of that. So within representational art you have this wide range axis of different styles at either end. Again, apologies for the slide. Another concept in art is the notion of form and content. Form is what something looks like, what it sounds like, how something is done. Content is the meaning you get from that. Okay, so for example, in your book, it talks about something called the Kiss by 2 different sculptors. One is Brancusi, 1908, the other one is Auguste Rodin in 1889. They're both called The Kiss, they're both about kissing, but they're done very, very differently. Rodin's sculpture is very naturalistic. We see the human, we see the body, we see the anatomy. They're both naked, they're embraced. On the other side, we have something which is much more abstracted. Brancusi's sculpture is one big block of stone with these 2 kind of geometric figures carved in it. And there's a sense of unity there, where the eyes come together, make one total eye. The stone itself is one total stone. The other one, Rodin, we see 2 separate objects, whereas in reality it's all one. It's all carved out of the same block of stone. But by changing the form, by changing what it looks like to us, we get 2 different interpretations or 2 different meanings. And this might be something you might want to reflect on for a little bit longer and stare at these things until it begins to happen. But I'll sort of shortcut that right now and tell you that the one on the right is much more sensual, it's much more physical, it's got more of a lustful attachment to the body and to each other as romantic lovers. The one on the left might be more the idea of unity, of 2 people coming together and being one. And so Brancusi's is often seen as a much more conceptual, abstract notion of kissing and unity and loving, and Rodin's a much more physical, sensual version of the same concept. We see the difference between form and content every day in the typefaces and the fonts that we use. And here are 3 types of letter A. And you're the first generation to really understand what Times New Roman or Helvetica means. When I was a child, nobody had any idea except typographers. Today, we use fonts all the time. And you're also aware that different fonts carry different messages. So if I was to ask you, which type of font would you use to type out a job application, it probably would not be the one on the right. The one on the right is a little more friendly, humorous, informal, casual. The one on the left is a little more sleek, modern, pared down, and the one in the middle is a little more traditional, old-fashioned, respectful, authoritative. And so these kinds of readings we recognize, we use all the time, and we see it everywhere in design. For example, here's two companies. One's Hot Topic and one is Seesaw. Which one do you think sells children's clothing? I don't think it's a great stretch of the imagination to identify it as Seesaw. By the shape of the letters, by the coloring chosen by the designer and the artist, it communicates a whole different feeling related to childhood and play. Hot Topic, on the other hand, with its jagged edges, its broken lines, its red coloring, has a much more gritty, edgy sort of typeface and font and look. And regardless of what the words mean, Hot Topic or Seesaw, we get a sense of the feeling of what they're about. So if you were a designer for Hot Topic and you decided to design it using Seesaw's colors and fonts, you probably would be fired. All right. We also see the difference between form and content in something called visual metaphors, things that stand for other things, and this is a very common one you've probably seen on television. On the right is the guy who represents Macintosh computers, Apple, and the guy on the left who represents PC. And we can tell just by looking at them, the guy on the right's younger, hipper, more casual, things that at least Apple wants you to understand relates to them. The guy on the left is older, a little more stuffy, a little more staid, kind of stuck in his ways, something Mac wants you to identify with PC and PC users. And so we're getting all of this information just by looking, by the color of the clothes, the style of the clothes, the postures. All of this sort of information creates in us an interpretation of meaning. What art is, essentially, is the manipulation of form. Artists will take subjects and things to paint and to draw from everyday life, but it's how you actually do it that makes the difference. It's not so much what you choose to do. And we see that all the time. We see it in language. If you take the expression, 3 words, I love you, depending on how you say it, you can get totally different meanings. And so that is the crux of what we're going to be looking at in this course, is the way in which things are created and presented and the meaning that they carry with them.